everybody. We are here with Springdale Law, and we're doing our Free Legal Advice Friday. Today, we're going to talk about some interesting things in the law. This is a very Texas-specific video, but it also will apply to any state where there's community property. So we're going to talk about the law as it applies to separate and community property in a state where someone has died without a will. And the state recognizes community property. So Texas is one of those states. There's 7 other states that do. Depending on where you live, this may apply to you as well.
I think this is a very interesting topic and very, very important to every single family, because we got a lot of inquiries and people was kind of shocking about what the law says and what they think how their assets will be passed on is totally different. It's kind of shocking to everyone. So I think that's why we want to make this video today and kind of go through what's going to happen to the separate property and community property if everything happened to you. First of all, let's talk about the difference between separate property and the community property and what's the definition. And then we can walk through a couple scenarios and Kitty will ask me those questions, and then you will see how wrong people are, and I will give you some right answers and you think, oh, I think that's a right answer. You'll feel it's very shocking. So let's get that started. What kind of property is separate property? What is community property?
Right. So separate property is property that came into the estate of the individual before a marriage. So if it's something that you owned before the marriage, so let's say that you purchased a vehicle before you got married, that is considered separate property because you purchased it before the marriage with your own funds. That can also apply to perhaps a home or whatever money you had in a separate bank account that existed before the marriage. Another thing that is separate property is if you receive inheritance during the marriage. The inheritance itself is considered separate property if you do not co-mingle those funds. So that's another term that we'll talk about for a second. Commingling is when you take funds that are separate or an item that is separate and you begin making payments with community funds. So funds from a joint bank account or funds that were made during the marriage. So if you want an item to stay separate and definitely be separate, you need to put it aside and pay for it with those separate funds that you have. If you can trace the separate funds that you had, so let's say that you had $20,000 in the bank before you became married, and then you turned that account into a joint bank account. If you keep track of your $20,000 that was your separate money the entire time, and you can do verified tracing, then you can say that $20,000 is still separate. But if you fail to trace that money, it becomes what's called co-mingled, and it can become community property by virtue of you not being able to trace the actual lineage of it staying separate. That can also be true of a house. So if you have a house that you purchased before the marriage, but you make payments to a mortgage using community funds, then it can become a community asset depending on how it's paid for. And if it's held by a judge to be a separate asset, then the spouse that you have has a claim for what's called contribution because part of their funds that were the community funds were used to pay the mortgage during the time of the marriage. So even if it remains a separate asset, then the spouse will have a claim for a portion for the part that they paid towards a mortgage or a car payment or anything like that. Now, let's talk about community funds. This one's a little bit easier. Community funds are everything that is not separate. So during the time that you're in the marriage, you have a claim in Texas for 1/2 of the profits of the time, talent, and labor of your spouse. So typically what that's going to mean is 1/2 of the salary or whatever payment that they get for any of the work that they do. Now, in a very specialized case, if there's something like oil royalties and things like that, there's specialized rules. If you have anything like that, you're definitely going to need an attorney. So go ahead and call us because the rules can get really complicated.
Income during the marriage or community funds. There are some exceptions.
Yes. So generally speaking, anything that's income that comes in during the marriage that comes from a job that you held during the marriage, it's going to be considered a community fund.
Like if the husband makes $500,000 a year and then the wife is only making like $200,000 a year, there's a huge difference, right? But that's a community property. That's the community funds. It doesn't matter who makes more or less.
Correct. It doesn't matter who makes more, who makes less. So there are lots of case law from back in the day where women were stay at home. And so it doesn't matter if there's one that's the only person that's working. It doesn't matter if one makes significantly more, significantly less than the other, but each partner is entitled to one half of that money that comes in for the other partner. There are some special rules on individual things, so like oil money, royalties, personal injury property, and things like that. So there are some specific rules with very limited exceptions to the community property rule that we just laid out. So if you have something that you're worried may be considered community versus separate property, it's definitely something to consult an attorney on. So go ahead and give us a call and we'll be able to help you with that.